So yeah, you should have seen a notification that we are recording. So just we're assuming you're happy to stay on that basis, but just be aware if you're asking questions, etc. So I just want to say a little bit before I pass on to Victoria about open research at Leeds, as an organisation where we're trying to head to with open research. So it's becoming more and more prominent across the sector as a whole, and certainly at Leeds, as I've highlighted there a section from the strategy, the new strategy that came out in 2020, which itself emphasises open research practice. There's a lot of work going across the sector. People may be aware of the UK Reproducibility Network, UKRN, so that's a very, it's grown rapidly actually out of originally the University of Bristol, I think. You can, I know colleagues, I'm not sure if Dr. Ika Rink from Polis is here, but he's acting as the local lead for UKRN. And if you would like to join a local network looking at UK Reproducibility Network, then there's a bit.ly link there. Again, a colleague could post that as the bit.ly link into the chat, so you can sign up and express your interest in joining that network. Just to emphasise as well, the Reproducibility Journal Club. So this is an early career researcher-led journal club. Happens sort of monthly. The next one's next Friday, I think. All welcome. As I say, it is early career researcher-led, but especially now, with being as everything's virtual, we get a lot of people from other universities as well as we have today at this session as well. So always worth going to, and I've certainly learned a lot from those sessions. Just to emphasise as well, a lot of the work around research culture. I think a lot of what we're doing and what we're talking about here in the context of open research applies to a broader sense of research culture. So you may have attended one of the research culture cafes that OD and PL are running recently. And obviously this is a broader discussion around research culture, but certainly open and transparent research is part of that. And there's a team, again, a Microsoft team with a link there if you'd like to join that. And but colleagues don't, we can post that into the chat as well in a moment. Just to mention as well, responsible metrics. So again, this is something else that the university has signed up to. So you may have heard of DORA, which is the Declaration of Open Research Assessment. The university has recently signed up to that. There's information there on the main website. We've got information on the library website as well. And just to flag up as well that we are hoping for, well, it's already planned for another one of these sessions, an open lunch series with Professor Stephen Curry, who's based at Imperial, and he's head of DORA, or a lead proponent of DORA, so he'll be talking in September, so look out for that. And again, that relates, I think, to research culture and potentially open research, as you'll see in the badge at the top. Let's change what we value in research. It's about how research is actually valued in terms of culture. So before I pass over to Victoria, just to emphasise the library support for open research. So obviously we're one stakeholder in a very complex, large research organisation, but we've long supported obviously open access to research and open data. So what this really is about for us is extending our support and the principles of open beyond open access to publications and open data, and extending that to some of the things that I think Victoria will be talking about in a moment. And obviously responsible metrics. Again, we do a lot of work in with a bibliometrician, a colleague Barbara, who can help you with bibliometrics and looking at that in a responsible manner, etc. So just to emphasise that this is an area that I think a lot of researchers are finding there's a lot of new skills they need to learn in this area, and also for us as research support staff as well. There's a lot of skills for us to learn to actually support colleagues in this area as well. So I'm very interested, as one of the things we're trying to do with this series of sessions is to learn from other colleagues in different disciplines. The issues do vary across disciplines, and that was really the emphasis of today's session, focusing on social sciences as perhaps open research or open science is often perhaps thought as a STEM issue. So with that, I'll introduce our speaker today. So very grateful to Dr. Viktoria Spaiser, who is Associate Professor in Sustainable Research and Computational Social Science from the School of Politics and International Studies here at Leeds. So Victoria is interested in sustainability research, specifically how societies can make a rapid, fair and empowering transition to zero emissions, zero pollution. So she applies mathematical and computational approaches to these and other social and political science research questions. Correct if I'm wrong, Victoria, but I think you're fairly quantitative, aren't you, in your approach? But so we did discuss, I mean, we're also interested in your views, or if you're able to perhaps comment on how this relates to qualitative social research as well. So with that, I'll hand over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nick. Okay, I'm gonna just quickly start sharing with you my slides. Okay. Right, so Nick has already introduced me nicely, so I don't have to do that again. We can just maybe start with just quickly, I mean, for those particularly who are maybe new to this series, seminar series, what actually is open and reproducible research before I start how it is, explain how it is relevant and how it can be done in social sciences. So open science involves making scientific methods, data, and outcomes available to everyone. That means we should be transparent about the way we collected data, about how we process the data, about how we analyze the data, how we came to the conclusions we are making. We should make those data available, and also all the kind of methods that we use to analyze the data, they should be available. And we should be quite transparent when communicating our results. Reproducible science, on the other hand, of course, is about allowing others, but also yourself later at later stage, to reproduce, to replicate what you have done in your analysis, in your paper. And so together, open and reproducible science means that we're using open science workflows that would allow ourselves, but also others, to basically use our results, use our data, use our methods to overall, of course, contribute to greater scientific knowledge and progress. So there are important benefits of doing open and reproducible science. One is, of course, the transparency in the scientific process, so that anyone, including the general public, can access the data, the methods, and the results. And of course, that makes those results also usable, and other research can build it on, and for instance, policymakers can actually use those results to as evidence for their policies. It, of course, allows then other researchers to more easily replicate our analysis and also extend on our work, right, to build on the work that we've done and doing additional analysis on top of it. It also would support peer review and overall collaborative learning in the scientific community. And it does support you as well. So, of course, it helps also you to rerun your own analysis. So let's say you have done some analysis and you come back to it 5 years later, and if you haven't really properly, coded up everything and, logged everything that you've done, you might be completely at loss and not really know what you have actually done 5 years ago. And so it helps you as well. And actually it helps you also beyond that. It helps you to have more citations, because if people can actually use your work, they are more likely to actually then cite you as well. And of course, overall, it does facilitate scientific progress, and it will, it enhances trust in science. Now, while open and reproducible science is more established in some other disciplines, particularly in medicine, it is quite strongly established. It is something more new in the social science sphere, and probably one of the reasons why it is now becoming more of an issue is that there has been a lot of scandals in the recent years about that some of the research, quite influential research that has been published in the past, that people were not able to reproduce it, and that it didn't stand rigorous scrutiny. So there was the whole replication crisis to do with psychology, in psychology particularly, but social psychology, but also in other social science field. And this kind of, of course, contributed to awareness that a lot of the results that are published are potentially erroneous, and so that we as social sciences have to be more determined and more rigorous in kind of trying to make sure that our research is sound. And yet, if you look at this study that has been published last year, where researchers have been looking, into social science practice of, transparent, open, transparent, reproducible science using a data set of published papers between 2014 and 2017. Then actually the results show that not really much has changed, unfortunately. So if you look at these results, it is actually quite frustrating in a way. So what is maybe the highest number you see here is that, okay, 40% of the articles that were published are actually, publicly available, so not hidden behind paywalls. People can actually access those. But then it becomes really quite bleak, and even that is actually not really enough. 40% is quite little. So for instance, if it comes to pre-registration your studies and using research protocols that you basically publish within this pre-registration, then none of the published papers have done this at all. So this is something that really hasn't really penetrated social science much at all. Like how that you should maybe pre-register your studies before you even do them, and that you should outline exactly what you're planning to do, what kind of data you're going to collect in a protocol, so people can basically judge your results later against that protocol in a way. So that is not done at all. But even other things that that maybe are where you would think is kind of more common sense, or more people should be more aware of it, is not really that common. Like for instance, making data available is only 7% of the papers that have been published made the data available. Making scripts available, like the R script that you're using to analyze your data, or this data do file if you're using Stata, not at all. Like just 1% have made those scripts available. So it's really, really marginal. So overall, you can see that actually, although there was the whole scandal and there was a lot of awareness building in social science about those issues, there's still only minimal adoption of transparency and reproducibility related research practice in the social science field. So we definitely need to do something about that. Luckily, there is some good guidance actually how to do that, how to do better, how to actually become a more transparent. So open, transparent is kind of more or less the same. Transparent and reproducible social science researcher. So I would recommend this book here. I actually got it myself, and a lot of what I'm going to talk today about is actually based on this book. Now, it is a book that is kind of speaking more to quantitative social science researchers. However, a lot of the things that are raised there and explained are also relevant for qualitative researchers, and I will try to always expand on how this is relevant for qualitative social science research as well. But even if you're a qualitative social science researcher, I would still recommend buying this book. Some of the things will not be relevant for you, but some others will be, and wherever it's appropriate, I will also guide, suggest other readings for qualitative social science researchers specifically. So based on this book, there are some core principles that you need kind of to take into consideration if you want to be a transparent and a reproducible social science researcher. So one thing is kind of starting, basically when we when we kind of doing research, we usually kind of look, of course, you're doing some kind of literature review to understand what it actually has already been done in this field, what has been already found, with respect to the topic that we are researching. And here it's already where it starts, like where it is important that we do it in a kind of transparent and kind of open way. So one thing that that is suggested is kind of doing meta-analysis and systematic evidence synthesis that does not just cherry pick the results, the published results that maybe fit your narrative, but actually really takes into account the full picture, on a topic. Pre-registration, and we're going to go into this more in a bit. And a pre-analysis plan or research protocol. This is something that you basically then publish when you pre-register your study, doing sensitivity analysis to make sure that your results are robust. And I will also explain to what extent there might be some principles from that can be also derived for qualitative research. Reporting standards, so how do we actually communicate our results? What should we always include when we report our results? Then replication, doing replication, but also making sure that our analysis, our results are replicable. Data sharing, obviously, and script and material sharing, and then how one can ensure for certain workflows that you do open and reproducible research when you're doing your research. Okay, so let's start with the first thing that I mentioned, so the meta-analysis and systematic evidence synthesis. So at the moment, which also actually the statistic earlier that I kind of mentioned was showing that actually there's still too little meta-analysis really done in social science, and it does need really to expand, and it is an important important practice. In fact, many journals try to to encourage that kind of research, and they have specific paper formats for that kind of research, where you engage in systematic evidence analysis or in meta-analysis to make sure that repeatedly, we actually take a stock of what actually we know about a certain field, about a certain topic, before we then can kind of contribute to making progress on this. And what is important here is that it's not just literature review. So when we do literature review, quite often we would be very selective in what kind of studies we would cite in our paper, what kind of studies we actually take into consideration when we kind of do a literature review. So this is not that. Systematic evidence synthesis means that you really look in the whole picture. You try to basically absorb all that has been published on a certain topic, or if it's just too much, because of course there are some topics and some areas that are very large, then at least that what you do is then kind of to do like a random sampling from those published studies, and do repeatedly random sampling and see whether you will still get to the same conclusion about what this field has so far found if you are using different samples from those different studies that have been published. And it is a quite important task, obviously, because we can only make progress and build our knowledge if we acknowledge what has already been done and where there are still questions left open. And that, of course, and would also avoid certain biases that we might have as researchers if we cherry pick the results that are of interest to us. It is important also, like if we're quantitative or qualitative researchers, that when we do kind of the systematic evidence synthesis, that we do take into consideration both quantitative and qualitative research that has been done in the field, and not just kind of cherry pick the ones. If we're quantitative, then just looking at the quantitative studies. If we're qualitative, that we just look at the qualitative studies. So one thing that so far has not been really is not really done at all in social science, but I think is quite important, is pre-registration. And I must admit that I have not done that so far myself. And actually, like, I learned about this when actually preparing this this presentation. So thank you very much for this opportunity to have actually learned something myself. And I will make sure that I will do that in the future, because I think it is very important. So pre-registration means that you are archiving a read-only time-stamped study protocol in a public repository before you start your study. And there are different public repositories where you can do this kind of pre-registration of your study. One is, for instance, this open science framework that I have here with the link here. It also comes to like with a help page of how to create a pre-registration. This is kind of more for economic research, but however, it is open to any kind of research, so other social science research as well. But there are other platforms that are, for other disciplines. For instance, for political science, there is one, and if you have then access to those slides after my presentation, you will find it in the notes section, a link to the political science, open science kind of repository. Why is it important? So for quantitative researchers particularly, it is important because it upholds this distinction between generating hypotheses from existing observations and testing hypotheses with new observations. And this is kind of an effective solution, basically, to make sure that you have specified your research question, that you have specified your hypothesis prior, before you do the analysis, so that actually then people can relate it back to what you were setting out to do before you started your study, rather than kind of adjusting it ad hoc after you're doing your study, kind of then, basically omitting certain hypotheses that didn't work and only focusing on the ones that did work. So the goal is, of course, to avoid kind of a hindsight bias, to report also null results. This is something that is obviously a problem and is related with this publication bias, because journals, of course, prefer to publish results where there is something significant, something of interest has come out. But actually, for real scientific progress and understanding, we also need to be aware of the null results, right? Like what did not work, which hypothesis could we not confirm? And in a way, this pre-registration makes sure that we don't kind of sideline those results as well, but we do report them as well. Now, how is that potentially relevant for qualitative researchers? So there is actually this paper on pre-registering qualitative research, and I would recommend that to those of you who are qualitative researchers. It is also relevant for qualitative researchers as well. I understand, of course, in qualitative research, you don't test hypotheses, so you don't have to specify the hypothesis prior to doing your results, your analysis. Qualitative research is kind of generating hypotheses. So it's a proper kind of post-diction research where you do certain observations, and then from that observations you generate your hypothesis or your assumptions, your theoretical, kind of statements. However, it's still important kind of that that certain things are pre-registered, because even though you don't have any hypothesis, your research will have certain aims. You will set out to answer certain questions, right? So those things can be, of course, pre-registered. Also, you usually will come into the field when you're doing your research with certain kind of philosophical paradigms that you are, certain theoretical values that you kind of hold, and on which basis you then interpret your data and collect your data. And it's important to be transparent about those as well. So kind of, again, this is something that you can then use in the pre-registration form to outline the process by which you want to collect this data, to make kind of, again, that can be pre-registered. So again, it can be done later when you kind of publish your research. It can be kind of reference back to what you have set out to do in the beginning. And in a way, it kind of also allows you kind of to track, like, this emergent design. Like, and of course, a lot of qualitative research is very flexible. You change it while you're doing your research. And, this kind of pre-registration can, help you to actually track those different changes along the way, right? So you kind of log those changes along the way. So in a way, the pre-registration kind of encourages kind of researchers who are doing qualitative research to carefully reflect, upon the values and, that they're bringing with them when they're going into the field, and before they're interpreting the data. So, and this kind of transparency that, that would result from this pre-registration would actually enhance also qualitative research. So what we do normally publish when we do pre-register our data, our analysis and our research is a pre-analysis plan, also called research protocol. And what should go in there? So first of all, you kind of outline your study design in this research plan. You say, okay, do you want to make a randomized controlled trial? Are you going to collect panel data that you want then to analyze using, like, regression models for fixed effects? If you're a qualitative researcher, are you going to do discussion groups, or are you going to do some participatory observation? So all that kind of things can be and should be outlined in this pre-analysis plan. Then you outline and describe your study sample. So, who is exactly your study object? Like, from whom are you going to collect the data, both when it's quantitative or qualitative? If it's quantitative data, again, you have to also specify how are you going to deal with, missing data. How are you going to, treat it in a way? How are you going to deal with, potential attrition, particularly if you kind of collect panel data? But also, of course, in the qualitative research as well, you have to specify how would you deal, for instance, with non-response. If your interview partners, for instance, don't agree to be interviewed, how are you going to replace them with other interview partners, stuff like that. Then you have to specify the primary and the secondary outcome measures, or in qualitative kind of context, the conceptualization of your study. So in quantitative terms, it's like, the variable specification. So what variables are you going to collect? Which are the outcomes variables that you are interested in predicting and understanding? Are there certain causal chains that you want to investigate, particularly if you're doing, like, for instance, a randomized control trial? if you are doing qualitative research, to outline the interview questions, for instance, you kind of prepare an interview guideline prior to doing those interviews. You have also, if a qualitative researcher, then you would also discuss and justify the kind of concepts that you are going to look into in your research. The next 2 points are more kind of for quantitative researchers, so families of mean effects. So for instance, if you have a number of different outcome measures, then you might want to combine them into indexes, for instance, and then of course you have to outline it as well in your pre-analysis plan. If you have multiple hypothesis testing, so where you kind of test several hypotheses, then again you might want to outline how you would adjust for this, because it's in the nature of null hypothesis testing statistically that some of your results will be then significant even if they're not actually, even if you should actually not reject the null hypothesis, just because you're running multiple kind of tests basically. So, and there are ways to deal with this potential problem. Adjusting for this potential problem, and for adjusting the p-values for that potential problem, and again that should be specified in this pre-analysis plan. If you want to look into subgroups, for instance, if you want to look into to what extent belonging to a certain group, so kind of having certain baseline characteristics is having an effect on your outcome variables, so you're kind of testing for heterogeneous treatment effects, then again this is something that you should specify in your research in your research protocol. And it's quite important because theoretically, of course, if you have data, there are many possibilities of kind of looking into subgroups, theoretically justified or not. And so to kind of avoid that you then do that like kind of post hoc whatever that has worked, that you report on those, you kind of specified it in advance, again, so that it can be then cross-referenced, cross-checked with your publications later. And of course, that's also relevant for qualitative researchers. So if you do, if you interview, for instance, people from different groups, you have to, of course, to specify which groups you are going to target. The direction of effect. So this is particularly relevant if you're doing a one-directional statistical test like the Pearson chi-square test. It's basically those one-directional statistical tests are actually only valid if you pre-specify your basically the direction that you expect the effect to go. So it is almost like a condition for those tests, the results from those tests being valid. Then you specify, of course, the exact methodology that you're going to use to analyze your data. So the exact kind of specification of the models you're going to use. Is going to be a linear model, a generalized linear regression model. What kind of control variables are you going to include, if any? What kind of estimation are you going to use for standard errors? Are you going to use a robust estimation, and so on? You should specify the equations that you basically use when you estimate your models, what kind of distribution assumptions you are making. And for qualitative research, again, you would of course use certain qualitative methods to analyze your qualitative data. So a certain type of discourse analysis method, for instance. And again, this is something that you should then outline in your research protocol. If you're kind of testing formal mathematical model, then again, you should specify that obviously in your research plan, like for instance, specifying the utility function that you're gonna use, because there are many different ones. So again, this has to be specified. And importantly, this research plan has to be time-stamped, because of course it only is valid if it is really a pre-registration. So if you publish this research plan before you actually start collecting data or analyzing the data. So time-stamping it kind of guarantees that it is indeed that you have already indeed kind of outlined all those things before you started your research. Now, if you're a quantitative researcher, an important part of being a transparent and reproducible researcher is actually doing sensitivity analysis. So this is kind of about this transparency, to making sure that your results are transparent and that you don't just report the result that fit your narrative and kind of throw overboard all the other ones. So sensitivity analysis are basically approaches that construct alternative estimates by combining or averaging across many models. or many analytical decisions. So there's, for instance, the Bayesian model averaging. There are also the bootstrap reality checks where you kind of check your preferred model against the against the benchmark model with repeated bootstrap sampling. If you have multiple hypothesis testing adjustment, then there are, of course, methods to adjust for that as well. So all those kind of things are part of the sensitivity analysis. And what they make sure is that basically you really don't just test, you don't just like pay attention to what you, on your model without taking into consideration that potentially the data is actually suggesting that there are other models that are better than the one model that you prefer. And of course, it kind of makes sure that you don't do p-hacking, where you basically try to make sure that you get the significant result you want to have. It is particularly important to do those sensitivity analysis if, for instance, you were not able to publish a pre-analysis plan, or if it was not viable, and if your research is a non-experimental design, because in that context, of course, there are many potential hypotheses and models that you could have tested, and if you have not specified them before, then it's not really clear what your results that you publish are based on, and whether you have to take into consideration alternative models, alternative explanations. And how robust your models are really against, for instance, potential false positives if you're, for instance, doing multiple hypothesis testing. So the core message here is really kind of to try to test really for all models, and more extended to include also qualitative researchers, to consider all possible explanations for your data and be transparent about that. Of course, sensitivity analysis is particularly something that is relevant for quantitative researchers. However, I think there are some principles from the sensitivity analysis that actually qualitative researchers do apply. For instance, like using multi-coders if they're analyzing the data qualitatively, coding up the data qualitatively, to make sure there is that you don't get kind of biased coding in your analysis. But also, if you're analyzing your data, kind of trying to consider alternative explanations for what you see in your data, for what you see in your qualitative data, should be relevant to qualitative researchers as well. Potentially, like maybe sharing, talking to other qualitative researchers, see whether they would see other things in the data as well. So all that could be part of a sensitivity analysis in qualitative research as well. So just to give an example from my research, we actually did a study. It was a replication study, and I'm going to talk about replication in a bit. But basically, there is a theory, democratization theory, advanced by Engelhardt and Welzel, who say, in short, that basically first a country develops economically, then once people have reached a certain level of affluence, then they kind of change their cultural values. They become, more oriented towards self-expressive values, more kind of emancipatory values, and that kind of leads then to democratization. So they kind of, collected data to analyze this hypothesis. And what we did then in our analysis actually to basically do a sensitivity analysis of their models. So to what extent actually, if you consider all other possible models, to what extent actually this, this holds, like their model holds. And what we found is actually, if you kind of create a model space of alternative, models of alternative explanations of the patterns in the data, then actually their model was not the one that was mostly supported by the data. And so this is what this publication was about. And as I said, it is also a replication study, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute as well. Another important part of being an open and transparent reproducible research is, of course, how we actually communicate, how we report our analysis. So the first, what we talked about before, was all about pre-registration. So where we kind of outline what we want to do, before we do the analysis. Then the sensitivity analysis, actually, when we do the research, what should we do to make sure that our analysis are actually robust. This is now, once we have finished our analysis, how do we report those results? How do we communicate our results? And what should be included in those in our publications? And this is to make sure that there's a transparency and also disclosure, and hopefully there's a standardization then in the way we kind of communicate our research as well, to make sure that they all are of high standard in terms of openness and transparency. So first thing, of course, that every study should include is kind of the context of the study. So who has funded the study, and is there a conflict of interest? In the previous, like in one of the previous slides, where I kind of talked about the study that has looked into those different social science publications and seen, for example, they uphold those openness and transparency principles. Actually, only very few studies have indicated conflict of interest or have reported anything like that. In fact, most of the, I mean, many journals have now, an automatic kind of closure where you have to indicate a conflict of interest. And if you don't have any, then of course that is what you then declare. So actually all the journals I publish would have that kind of thing, but it seems that some social sciences journals still don't have that. So if they don't, then you should include yourself in your publication as well. The study design, of course, should be, communicated transparently to your audience. So, what was your sampling? What variables exactly were collected, and with what specific questions, for instance. If you're doing a qualitative research, again, like what is your qualitative sample basically, and what interview questions were asked to get certain insights. Also the sampling size and how the sampling size has been determined. Then details about the data collection process itself. So when was the data collected, in what context, how was it collected, how did you deal with non-compliance, with attrition, and so on, all those things. Again, that's relevant for both qualitative and quantitative researchers. Data description, again, something relevant for qualitative and quantitative researchers. So for instance, the number of observations, how many interviews did you do, how many survey observations do you have? If you have a quantitative quantitative data, then of course means and standard deviations. But if you have a more kind of qualitative data set, of course you can still give some some descriptions of the data. So for instance, how many females, how many males were there in your sample of interview partners, for instance. Then analysis methods. So what methods, statistical methods have you used to analyze this data? That again is applicable for both qualitative and quantitative, because again, as a qualitative researcher, you also have a certain set of analysis methods that you use to do your research. So they have to be, of course, communicated. And how did you handle missing data? If you report results in terms of if you're quantitative research, then it's important that you also report confidence intervals. So this is something still that is not as prevalent as it should be. It's still too much a focus on p-values rather than confidence intervals and other measures. You should also report results of sensitivity analysis to kind of communicate openly that you and transparently what sensitivity analysis have you done and what results did they bring. If you've done some subgroup analysis, of course, those should be reported. And you should definitely report also the things that did not work. And of course, that's what this pre-registration kind of helps you with, because if you pre-register certain hypotheses that you are set out to test and then they don't appear in your publication, and people will raise that question, so why is actually this hypothesis not mentioned anymore in your publication? So this kind of pre-registration makes sure that you also mention null results. So for instance, your hypothesis didn't work, and then of course, if you have pre-registered that if you have pre-registered your study, then you would be forced actually to make some comment on why that it didn't work and why it might have not worked and so on. Then study limitations, of course. So what are the weaknesses of your data, of your methods? What are potential biases? Are your results generalizable in any ways? And you should also communicate whether your data, your code, so kind of the script that you use to analyze the data is available and where it can be found, of course. So to make sure that you can actually report on all those things, it is quite useful to do to have a project protocol. So this is something different from this research protocol that you upload when you pre-register your data, pre-register your study. The project protocol is for yourself, where you basically log basically every step of your research that you're doing. So you can always go back and look up, okay, what did I do? What did I do there? And what kind of result did it? What kind of result did it bring? So to make sure that you don't, forget any of those things that you actually should report, you should make use of those project protocols. So these kind of reporting standards are, I think, more or less, applicable to both qualitative and quantitative researchers. It's of course clear that you have certain limitations in, quite often limitations of words in your papers, but you can always make use of supplementary information, right? Of appendix and supplementary information, where you can then include much more information than you can in your actual research paper. So it's okay if you cannot include all of the null results in your paper, but they should at the very least, appear, all of them, in your supplementary information. So obviously, since it's called about open and reproducible science, it's important to make sure that we, first of all, do ourselves replication studies. Again, this is something that is not really done a lot. I think from this sample that they looked into social science publications, I think only 1% were actually replication studies. Definitely too little. We need much more of that to make sure that the results that we are publishing are actually robust and can be replicated. And in a way, it's also an ethical question, right? Because particularly social science, in fact, because policymakers may use our results, may use our research to then inform their policy making, and that will affect people. So if we cannot be sure that actually our results are trustworthy, then this can be quite fatal for people as well. And so it is important that we really make sure that our results are as robust as important, because it's also an ethical question. There are different types of replication studies. So if you're using the same data as was used in the original study, then and you use the same methods to do the research, then you're doing a verification study. If you're using the same data, but you changing the method slightly, you maybe add something or look into alternative models, for instance, then it's a reanalysis study. If you use different data, so you collected your own data, but you're using the same kind of methods and kind of trying to test the same hypothesis, then it's a direct replication study. And if you are using different data and different methods, but you're still kind of interested more or less in the same kind of hypothesis or concepts or kind of research topic, research questions, then you do an extension study. I think those two, so when you actually, modify the methods in a way, whether you're using same data or different data, is actually applicable for qualitative research as well. Because of course, qualitative researchers can publish their data as well. And then it can be reused by other researchers. However, because qualitative methods are not meant to be objective, and there's a lot of kind of flexibility in how those data is analyzed and so on, it's clear that it will never be an absolute replication or absolute verification of the original study. However, you can still engage with the original data or your own data, but the same kind of research questions, but changing slightly the method, or or maybe using a different philosophical paradigm to see whether what different outcomes or similar outcomes you may get or not if you're doing a qualitative research. So I think replication in a way is also relevant for qualitative researchers as well. If you want to do replication, of course, that and to make sure that your data, that your research is replicable, then it's absolutely paramount that you publish your data, that it's shared. If it's not already, publicly accessible data, of course, there are some, data sets that are already publicly accessible, that are, public goods, like let's say, World Bank data, whatever, or government data. Then, of course, then you don't have to reshare it again; it's already out there. And that you share your scripts, that you share, the data do file that you used, that the R script that you constructed to do the analysis, so people can really replicate or build on your analysis. Because even if they're if it's just a reanalysis, the reanalysis usually starts with the first step being a verification, basically kind of doing the same kind of analysis as has been done in original research, and then only building on top of it, modifying certain things. So for that, it's absolutely important that scripts are shared, and that we also provide a detailed and clear and transparent methodological description. Now, I understand that, of course, in qualitative research, and I'm going to talk about that a bit later again, you don't have scripts as such, but you're still using sometimes software like in vivo. I I believe I pronounced it correctly. And we were actually allowed to, for instance, export the codes that you have been producing when analyzing the data. And this is something that you potentially can share as well, right, with other researchers to help them building on top of your study. So just to get back again to the one example that I had before, because as I said, it was actually a replication study. Specifically, it was a reanalysis study, because what we did was actually to use the same data and to not only test the model that has been tested by the original authors, but actually test also alternative models, so modifying the method and modifying, you know, the models that we're looking and considering at. And to be fair, you know, like both Engelhardt and Wells, they were very cooperative, very professional at that. So although we kind of, in a way, said, well, actually your model doesn't seem to be that strongly supported by the data, they were still, you know, very open. And so this is really what we should also adopt as a researcher. So even like, you know, if other researchers do kind of try like to, you know, reproduce our studies and they come to, you know, to results that we might not like, we should be professional, you know, scientists in that, and be open to potential other explanations that those other researchers may come up with, and see where, like, you know, where we can maybe from there on work together to, you know, improve our whole understanding of the phenomena. So, as I said, for replication, but also beyond just replication, data sharing is absolutely important. So not only does it allow replication, but also actually it allows other researchers doing other analysis, testing other hypotheses potentially, and of course does you know, contribute to wider scientific progress. And it's equally important for qualitative and quantitative data. Qualitative data should be as much shared as quantitative data. It is as valuable as quantitative data for other researchers. One way to do this is, as suggested by this book, is kind of to like create a replication package that you basically publish along with your paper, and that replication package that would contain the data, the code, so the script that you have been using, and the documentation that describes both your data and the script. And you can do that. You can kind of basically, many journals now allow that kind of to publish this replication packages along with your paper as a supplementary information material, basically. But also you can of course make use of data sharing platforms like the UK Data Service, for instance, and you know, University of Leeds itself is allowing as well to you to share your data through its own framework. So there are many opportunities and ways to do this, to share your data. There are certain principles when you're sharing your data, what you should observe if you're doing, and there is the kind of so-called FAIR principle. The FAIR principle kind of says that the data should be findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, to make sure that really this data is actually useful for other researchers as well. And it doesn't only apply to the data itself, but also to the tools and workflows that you were using to collect the data in the first place. An example from my research again. So I did, for instance, a pilot study on environmental behavior using smartphones to collect, to conduct data in a field experiment. And I then published this data on UK Data Service. You know, it is quite, you have to, it's not only, you don't just dump your data on there, you actually have to, specify a lot, kind of document a lot your data, like, upload many other files as well to make really sure that it is upholding those FAIR principle. In fact, the journal that I published this paper in, this data science journal, it was requiring you to publish your data using this FAIR principle. Only then it would publish your paper. So it was a requirement of this journal anyway, and that's basically the case. Particularly in my field, computational social science field, data sharing, script sharing is pretty much now as well standard, I would say. In other social science research, not yet as much, but I hope that will come as well soon. There are, of course, limitations in data sharing, and I'm aware of that, and I don't want to deny that. For instance, important limitation is if you're using proprietary data, like Twitter data, for instance. So I, for instance, work a lot with social media data, with Twitter data, and that cannot be shared. Unfortunately, that's against the terms of conditions by Twitter, outlined by Twitter. Twitter does not permit you to share the data you collect from Twitter using, for instance, its APIs. So what do you do if that's the problem? So one way to kind of go around it is kind of what Twitter permits is to share the Twitter IDs and the user IDs in your data set. So for instance, if you collected, let's say using the Twitter API, a set of tweets, then you can publish those tweets IDs, and then people can, try to replicate that data by collecting the same kind of data again themselves. However, you very quickly kind of run, of course, into problems because what Twitter allows you, what the API allows you is very limited, particularly if you're not paying for it. Then, you have limited access to historical data. And of course, if it's really historical data, let's say like 10 years ago, then actually you may end up, finding that, for instance, some users disappeared meanwhile, some tweets have been deleted meanwhile, so it will be more difficult then to replicate and to exactly get the same data that has been used in the original study. So this is really a problem, but it's a problem arising from the fact that it's a property data that we're using here. Another issue that you might find, you might stumble into, is confidential data. So, if you have, certain private data that, for instance, allows identification, then you cannot necessarily publish that data, or, if you have certain confidential agreements with your data subjects. One way to potentially deal with it, if that's, if this is something that kind of is included in the agreement you make with your subject that you're studying, is, for instance, to remove certain confidential data from your data set that you then publish. Or replace it with something else that would still allow to replicate your analysis. So in my data, for instance, in the one that I published here, because here I collected GPS records along with the smartphone app from which I collected the data, but GPS records would, for instance, allow the identification of people's, where people live, right? That's of course highly sensitive and confidential, cannot be published. So I was not able to include GPS records in this data. But what I was able to include was the distances that I could calculate from those GPS records, because of course ultimately I recorded those GPS records to be able to calculate the distances that people are traveling with certain transport means, and those distances calculate from the original GPS records I could include in the published in the shared data set. So there are sometimes ways around kind of if you have confidential data. Similar, if you want to allow other people to replicate your studies, and if you want to allow people to make progress, methodological progress, then you should also always make sure that you share your script. So if you're using R, use your R script. If you're using Stata, then publish your Stata-do file. If you're using Python, then publish obviously that. Again, it can be included either within the replication package that you then publish along with your paper. And again, there are similar, like to data sharing platforms. There are script sharing platforms out there, like for instance GitHub, or for R specifically the cron, which allows you to upload and publish R packages that, for instance, would summarize and would include all the analysis that you did for your paper, for instance. So these are ways kind of to make sure that you share your scripts and allow people to reproduce your research. It's important that when you do publish those scripts, that you include lots of comments and annotations, because not just for other people, but also for yourself, you will find that it's much easier for yourself than to redo your analysis if you actually done proper commenting and annotation of your scripts, that you always explain what are you doing. Basically, you can never have too many comments or too many annotations. That's the
Victoria, just to let you know that it's just gone 26 minutes past the hour. Right, so okay. We're probably going to overrun a little bit, everybody. We are recording, and I think it'd be great to capture the full presentation. So anybody, if you do have any questions, put them in the chat box and we will put them to Victoria at the end. Victoria, if you'd like to just carry on.
Okay, I'm almost finished. Sorry about that. I should have timed myself. Just here, example for myself. With the study that I mentioned before, we actually did study. We did also publish the R package that we used to do those analysis on R. We uploaded it to the cron platform. And here, then just as a final thing, so if you want if you do open and reproducible research, you should engage with reproducible workflows. That means that you always do everything with scripts. If you're doing quantitative analysis, that you never do by hand modifications of your data or by hand calculations, or using drop-down menus, for instance, SPSS, that you're using the command line instead of kind of having all the commands, all the kind of things that analysis you're doing in your script. To have a version control, so you can always kind of check that, how your script has changed over time, over the analysis. And certain platforms like GitHub and Dropbox allow specifically for this version control. This is also important, obviously, for qualitative research. And then, it could be quite helpful to actually write code and the manuscript together. So there are, again, like, certain packages like R Markdown and Jupyter that allow you to do this, and to use research protocols and project protocols, also quality research, to make sure that you always log everything. Make sure that you publish your papers, obviously, as much as possible open access. If you have no funding for doing open access publication, then you can always upload your paper to a repository. University of Leeds has, of course, its own one, it's Symplectic, but there are also other ones where you can upload your paper to make sure it's accessible by everyone. And maybe one more issue, I think what's quite often not really talked about is, like, if you're doing open and reproducible research, transparent research, you should also always publish corrections. So if you find that you have done a mistake, if you then discover a mistake in your publication, or if someone else kind of points out that you have made a mistake, then you should publish a correction correcting this mistake, pointing out that you have made a mistake and publishing a correction. In my case, for me, it actually happened twice. Once it was myself who found that I did a mistake. Another time someone else told me you made a mistake. And then in both cases, I did publish a correction to make sure that it is corrected. And people know this, that there was a mistake. If it's a small mistake, as was luckily in my case, then you can just publish a correction. If it's a big mistake that basically invalidates your whole results, then of course the only way out is kind of a retraction. It's not nice, but this is something that, as an open and transparent reproducible researcher, you should do as well if that happens to you. And it can happen to to good researchers as well. It's nothing to be ashamed of. Okay, that's it from myself. Sorry about a bit going over time. I'm aware that we have very little time for questions and answers, but I don't know, maybe one.
Thank you very much, Victoria, for a really comprehensive and interesting, lots of tips, presentation on reproducible research. I haven't seen any questions coming in the chat box, but if anybody would like to come onto the microphone and ask Victoria a question, please just make yourself known in the chat box and we'll invite you to unmute. Perhaps one quick question, Victoria, about some of your earlier slides. You showed some analysis of really quite a low take-up of some of the methodologies that you've described in social sciences. The study was, I think, from 2017. Do you sense that there is a bit of a change going on in terms of a greater uptake from social scientists? And also, what are the most persuasive arguments or issues we can engage social scientists with?
Yes, I think so. The study was published in 2020, but it was from the data set was 2014 to 2017.
I see.
It was, I mean, I don't think it has majorly changed since then. There is a growing awareness, and of course, like those seminars, like what you do is highly contributing to this, and it's really great you're doing that here in the University of Leeds. I think it's very important kind of to raise this awareness, but also kind of to tell people how to do this, right? So it's one thing to know this should be done, but also knowing how to do that. And so it's great that this book has come out. I would really recommend buying this if you want to engage with reproducible research. I think an important argument, but it's part of doing ethical research, to being ethical researcher, because as a social scientist, we have to be aware that our research can be used by policymakers, by people out there to make decisions that will affect people. And if what we did was not right, what was kind of biased, was not correct, was transparent, then we will be implicitly contributing to potentially wrong policies, right, that would affect people maybe in a harmful way. So I think it's part of being an ethical researcher, being a responsible researcher, doing open and reproducible research.
Thank you. Yeah, so I think that's very persuasive, the kind of doing the right thing, whether people have the skills and time to do all the you know, the best practice is another issue. And it's somebody's commented in the chat, Pammy, that this is all kind of new material for her, and or him, sorry, I don't know the gender, Pammy, they. It is new material for them, and so you've heard about this, Pammy, but you've not had to do it yet. And you can see that it's coming as a necessity for publication. And as Victoria was saying, for, you know, ethical and robust research, who can you speak to in the library to get some help? Well, again, it depends which bit of the research life cycle you need help with, but do just drop us a line on the researcher at library, email, contact, and we can either help you from within the library. For example, if it's about research data, we can certainly help you with that. If it's about open access publication, we can help you with that. But we can also signpost you off to other sources of support at the university. Kieran, you've got your hand up. Do you want to come onto the microphone and unmute and ask your question?
Thanks. Thanks, Victoria. Really, really interesting. I think for me, one of the things that was quite new was the idea of pre-registration. And all the other stuff, you know, I've heard a lot about, but that was really kind of new to me. And I was wondering to what extent something like that works with investigations that focus more on secondary data sources, where I think often, at least in my situation, I found that data sources don't always come with fantastic metadata. And so that sometimes limits the extent to which you can form questions prior to actually getting hold of the data. So does that process change, or are there ways around things like that, do you think?
Yes, I mean, it is indeed, the pre-registration is mainly, I mean, it's particularly important for those where you actually test hypotheses, right? Where you have a certain hypothesis and you want to test them. It kind of makes sure that you do indeed test all the hypotheses, that you do what you outlined to do in the original kind of pre-registration. And it's less kind of, I guess it's kind of less conducive to like for explorative research, like, you know, where you kind of more do like an explorative research. However, as I kind of, you know, outlined, I think for qualitative research, there is still some value in actually using this pre-registration for that kind of research as well, because you will still, like, you know, go into like even like, you know, secondary data analysis with certain assumptions you want to test, with certain research questions, with certain kind of, you know, theories potentially, like, you know, certain goals. And I think all those things can be still outlined in the pre-registration, and, you know, should be outlined in the pre-registration form. But because you kind of don't do this kind of where you specify the hypothesis originally, if you do explorative research, I think then sensitivity analysis actually, particularly if you're a quantitative researcher, and I think you are, then I think sensitivity analysis becomes even more important if you are, if you kind of don't pre-register your data, your study in advance, to make sure that you then, you know, at least kind of make sure that you have then accounted for all possible, you know, flaws and all possible explanations and models when you're doing analysis.
That's a really good point. Thanks.
Thank you, Victoria. Are there any more questions in the chat, or does anybody else want to put their hand up? Perhaps with your indulgence, I'll ask one final question if there are no other ones, and then we perhaps draw it to a conclusion. But I was very struck, Victoria, towards the beginning of your presentation, you talked about the importance of meta-analysis and the risk of bias in literature reviews. And I just wondered to what extent researchers are aware of this as a problem. Is this something that's discussed widely in your field? And I suppose I'm being a bit library-centric in that we support kind of literature review methodology, whether there's more that we could do to raise awareness of this area.
I think part of the problem is, and in fact, here again, pre-registration can be important, extremely important, because if it becomes a norm, like it is in some studies, in some subjects like medicine, for instance, if it becomes a norm, then every study is pre-registered, and then it will become much more easier to do actually proper literature review and proper meta-analysis, because you can then always go back and find all the studies that, you know, have been done on a certain subject, rather than kind of trying to figure out yourself, like, you know, by browsing and Googling and whatever. So it becomes a much more systematic and much more easier to do actually proper meta-analysis. So that's another actually argument for doing pre-registration of the studies, because that helps actually as well in this process of meta-analysis and making sure that it is really systematic and that you don't omit potentially important results that have been published and have been done, important analysis that have been done.
Fantastic, thanks very much. So I think with that, great, thanks to Victoria, really, really interesting, and thank you everybody for coming today. Nick, would you like to draw the event to a conclusion?
Just say thank you, Victoria, and thank you for sticking around. And as I say, if people do want to hang around a few minutes, if we're in a room on campus, wouldn't you? You might just sort of say a few words or ask a few questions on the way out. So I'll certainly hang around for a little while. But yeah, thank you very much. I just wanted to pick up on what Pammy was saying in terms of this being new, and I think even you suggested that some of that was new to you, Victoria, the pre-registration.
Yeah.
And we were talking about that this morning, weren't we, Rachel? Because this morning, I'm learning loads, and I think this is a really good, interesting question, which I sort of alluded to at the beginning. As one stakeholder in a big research-intensive university, where are the boundaries in this sort of stuff? I'm not an academic. I'm a central service, working in a central service, as is my colleagues, Rachel, etc. And something like pre-registration, I've learned about from reproducibility and some of the other stuff, the early career stuff that's going on. We talked about that this morning as well. I've incorporated it into sort of the standard webinar I'm trying to develop for open research. So it's new to all of us, Pammy, I suppose, if you're still there, just to sort of, talk to many of us. And I think the trick is how we sort of communicate that and get people talking to each other and crossing disciplines as well. I think some of that's come from psychology, from my understanding, the pre-registration. And a colleague of ours, Marlene Mangoni, who's actually a mechanical engineer, and she's doing the next open lunch for us on barriers to open research in May. She also mentioned this morning registered reports and pre-registration, which was new to her as well. So I think we're all sort of learning together. That's really just to reassure everyone on that point, really. But yeah, thank you very much. And we will make the recording available and the slides at a later date. And if anybody would like to speak to anything, on these subjects, please do get in touch, because we'd like to learn from one another. So yeah, thank you very much. And enjoy the rest of your day.